Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishor from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at VeggieDiplomat. Was the victory of Gotabaya Rajapaksa in the recently concluded presidential elections in Sri Lanka a foregone conclusion? With the younger brother as the president, is the elder brother Mahinda Rajapaksa's bid to unquestioned political supremacy in the island nation unchecked? Is there a political danger of the island getting entangled in Sinhala nationalism? What happens to the goodwill projects carried out by India to help Sri Lankan Tamils to rebuild after the bloody civil war? Will the Indian fishermen be targeted and killed for crossing into Sri Lankan waters, just like how they were during the previous Rajapaksa regime? More importantly, was Delhi prepared for a Rajapaksa return? Does Delhi have a game plan to keep the Rajapaksas on a leash without conceding too much to Beijing? In the wake of the deadly Easter bombing, will there be greater security cooperation between Delhi and Colombo? What does the speed at which India dispatched its Minister for External Affairs, S. Jaishankar, to Colombo to invite Rajapaksa to New Delhi indicate? With Prime Minister Ranil Wickremasinghe resigning as Prime Minister, will Sri Lanka see the top two posts in the country being run by the two brothers? Hello and welcome to episode 23 of India Rising Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishor, a show in which we analyze the happenings from around the world and their impact on India. This week, Sri Lanka went to the polls to elect a new president for the next 5 years. The incumbent president, Maithripala Sirisena, had announced that he will not contest, clearing the way for the presidential house in Colombo to have a new occupant. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the 70-year-old younger brother of ex-President Mahinda Rajapaksa, was the candidate from the newly floated party Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, or the SLPP. United National Party declared Minister for Housing 52-year-old Sajith Premadasa, son of ex-President Ranil Premadasa. In the backdrop of Sirisena's presidency being viewed with the legacy of the failed promises, deteriorated security situation in the island in the wake of Easter bombings, and failure to revive the fragile economy, the avoidable constitutional crisis imposed by Sirisena by unconstitutionally removing Prime Minister Wickramasinghe in 2018, the mandate was seen as a referendum on Sirisena's presidency.
So the polls that we just concluded saw a highest ever turnout of 83%, which even eclipsed the last time's highest ever turnout of 81%. So this indicated like an anger among the people for regarding the president. In the end, Gotabaya Rajapaksa won by a fairly one-sided election, garnering 52% of the vote compared to just Sajith Premadasa's 42%. Now, Sajith Premadasa, while conceding defeat, congratulated Gotabaya, saying, "At the conclusion of a hard-fought and spirited election campaign, it is my privilege to honor the decision of the people and congratulate Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa on his election as the 7th president of Sri Lanka." End quote. Now, within a day, Gotabaya Rajapaksa taking oath as the president, came the news that the incumbent Prime Minister Ranil Wickremasinghe was resigning, and I guess the elections are due to happen in February 2020. And a day later, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was earlier president, was now appointed as the caretaker prime minister until the elections, which will happen sometime early next year. So, Kishore, can you brief us about the legacy of Rajapaksas from an Indian perspective?
Yeah, sure. So we all know that Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president for two consecutive terms from 2005 to 2015, and the military victory that the Sri Lankan armed forces had over the LTTE in 2009 helped him to win the 2010 elections almost in a one-sided election. So it was obvious that Mahinda, as the president, and Gotabaya, who was the defense secretary then, were accused of killing Tamils and also were accused of giving orders to harass and kidnap journalists who wanted to cover the plight of the Tamils. With such human rights records, it was obvious that New Delhi would not support their cause, as it would alienate India from the Western world. Not only that, within India too, the domestic politics playing out at that time indicated that the UPA government that we had in India had support coming in from the Tamil parties from Tamil Nadu, and these Tamil parties were not in favor of helping the Sinhala dominated Sri Lankan armed forces to be weaponized and to be given with the intelligence information to go and launch a major offensive against the LTTE. So, although the Rajapaksa actually, although Mahinda Rajapaksa had actually come down to New Delhi asking for weapons and other information, India had to turn down his request, and that actually forced India to that actually forced Rajapaksa actually to go to the Chinese asking for help. So China could not care less about the human rights records or anything of that nature. In fact, China has never attached a high priority to it. So Sri Lanka wanted money after the elections, and China wanted a foothold in the Indian Ocean. So it was a win-win situation for both of them. So as India watched helplessly, Sri Lanka had fallen into the dragon's embrace. And then came the elections of 2015, in which, if some reports are to be believed, India apparently played a part in ousting Mahinda Rajapaksa through its agency, the RAW. This was, however, denied by both the Indian government and also the then Sri Lankan minister in the Sri Lankan parliament. Uh,
So, Kishore, it seems that not only our Western friends, but even our Southern friends claim that Roy is doing nefarious activities in their neighborhood.
Oh, indeed. Indeed. But I think there may be some truth to it. You never know. But still, India would want Sri Lanka to be firmly within its zone of influence. After all, Sri Lanka is a very, very strategically important neighbor for us. So, yeah, that's about it in terms of the legacy. So, Mohal, you want to talk about the Sirisena presidency and
Yeah,
how
so
we view the whole presidency?
Yeah, so it was evident that the president Sirisena and the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremasinghe, even though they came together in 2015 to defeat Rajapaksha as a united front, the combination in the end failed to meet India's expectations. So Sirisena didn't conduct free and fair investigations into the alleged corruption in lucrative deals that Sri Lanka had entered with the Chinese, benefiting the Rajapaksha family. On the contrary, under Sirisena's watch, the nation witnessed a bond scam in which the former head of a bank was accused of manipulating bond auctions in 2015, causing a loss of millions to the Sri Lankan exchequer. Now, Sri Sena reneged on his poll promise of establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to bring the 23-year-old civil war which had ravaged the island nation to a logical conclusion, and thereby keeping the Tamil minority disillusioned. In addition, like Mahinda Rajapaksa started visiting India to meet the political who's who in New Delhi, including Prime Minister Modi. India didn't openly back the Rajapaksas, but it was clear that India didn't mind the Rajapaksas coming back to power in Colombo as long as its three red lines were addressed. One, India's security interests should be kept in mind when Colombo engages with others, China and the US, for instance. Uh, Two, India did not mind Sri Lanka's commercial and trade ties with China, but it would not tolerate Chinese military presence in the island nation. I think this was seen in the second term of Rajapaksha when I think a couple of nuclear submarines, or I forget, like maybe it might be conventional submarines, did dock in Colombo port,
Right.
and which read alarm bells ringing in the South Block in New Delhi regarding this military presence of Chinese naval vessels in Colombo. And coming back to the third point, India wanted the minorities, particularly the Tamils, treated with dignity and as equal citizens in Sri Lanka. So now it was amply clear that Mahinda Rajapaksa had agreed to all three demands, as Modi was the first to congratulate Gotabaya in an effort to reorient India and Sri Lankan relations. And I think last year Mahinda did make. I mean, it wasn't a high profile visit, but it wasn't low key either. I mean, he did meet Prime Minister Modi, and that's when the rumor started swirling that India was probably getting around to the fact that Rajapaksa would win, as he had already won in the local body elections early last year. So New Delhi read the tea leaves that that meant that Rajapaksa would come back sooner rather than later into the front to the front in Sri Lankan domestic politics.
I think it was Modi's way of garnering bipartisan support within Colombo. The UNP, headed by Ranil Wickremasinghe, has long been seen as a pro-India party,
Yeah.
but the same could not be said for Mahinda Rajapaksa. So I think
Hmm.
this kind of a visit by Rajapaksa to Delhi when he was not in power, and Prime Minister Modi giving him a patient hearing, and
Hmm.
also expressing India's concerns, actually meant that India was willing to be on talking terms with both of them, and would not actually be favoring any political party within Colombo. So I think that helps India in the long run as well.
Yeah. So Kishore, do you think that India should be wary of the Rajapakshas because there has been a strained relationship with Rajapaksa, especially the second term between 2010 and 2015 between India and Sri Lanka?
Yeah. So I think in terms of the context, we need to understand that, as you said, Modi was very, very quick to congratulate Gotabaya on his stupendous victory. In fact, Modi also took to Twitter when he said he looked forward to working closely with Gotabaya. And he said he wanted it for deepening the close and fraternal ties between our two countries and citizens, and for peace, prosperity, as well as security in our region. So, the election of Gotabaya and the subsequent appointment of Mahinda as the caretaker PM should actually be seen from multiple different angles. Uh, let me pick one of them, and then Mohal, you can pick the rest. You can pick the others as well. First of all, let me talk about the Pakistani angle. Disturbing news of Gotabaya are emerging now, which actually might make New Delhi be a little wary of him. As a young army officer in the early 1970s, Rajapaksa was sent to Pakistan for an officer's training course, at a time when actually Sri Lanka maintained strong relations with Pakistan. Later, during the war with the LTTE, when he was the defense secretary under Mahinda, Pakistan military apparently supported the Sri Lankan army. If some accounts are to be believed, Pakistan Air Force pilots participated in the airstrikes in 2008 against the LTTE bases. Pakistan had apparently also deputed some of its army officers to Colombo to guide the Sri Lankan security forces in their operations. And just like India, Pakistan too was quick to congratulate. In fact, Imran Khan congratulated Gotabaya, expressing the hope that the new dispensation in Colombo would reverse some of the earlier decisions taken by Colombo vis-a-vis Pakistan. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, Wickremasinghe actually seemed to be pro-India, and he was parroting India's lines more often than not, even when India boycotted the SAARC summit in Islamabad. So I think Pakistan now hopes that all that would be reversed under Gotabaya. So it needs to be seen if that will actually become a reality or not. Mohal?
Yeah, so coming to China, I mean, there is, in addition to the close links that the Rajapaksha family has with China, has always been a pestering issue for India. After all, it was due to Mahinda Rajapaksa's affinity to China that forced like Sri Sena to sign away the Hambantota port to China on a 99-year lease, because the debt had gotten too big to handle and they didn't see any other way other than to sign a 99-year lease. Now, I think India has gamed the unfolding situation quite well. I mean, Mahinda Rajapaksa's visits to Delhi should be analyzed in this regard. Now, it is obvious that India would have gotten some insurances from the Rajapaksas to play the game by Delhi's rules. In fact, in one of his interviews given to defense journalist Nitin Gokhale during his visit last year, Mahinda Rajapaksa had said that China is our trading partner, but India is like our brother, end quote. So, I mean, after all, the incumbent PM Ranil Wickremasinghe and President Sri Sena couldn't even see eye to eye on a number of issues, leading to the constitutional crisis in 2018.
And remember, Mohal, we covered that in one of our earlier episodes immediately after the constitutional crisis unfolded. So
Mhm.
we kind of knew that the politics in Colombo was seeing drastic changes, and the recent elections are a testimony to that fact. Okay, so within Sri Lanka itself, we can look at the domestic identity politics. Gotabaya and uh, Mahinda uh, are still seen as Sinhali supremacist leaders. In fact, this explains why the Tamil and the Muslim minorities voted en masse for Sajith Premadasa. Will Gotabaya respect the democratic institutions? Will he help the minorities get their due after all the long years of fighting? Only time can tell. Only time can have the answers for all that. After all, in his thank you speech soon after winning, he said, I am conscious that I'm also the president of those who used the vote against me, he said, as he was formally declared the hands down winner with 52% of the vote. He also said, it is my duty to serve all Sri Lankans without race or religious discrimination. I promise to discharge my duties in a fair manner, unquote. But then, for the Rajapaksas, will old habits die hard? As strategic affairs expert Brahma Chalani said in one of his articles, will Gotabaya end up enforcing a mono-ethnic identity on a multi-ethnic country? So that's the primary question that everybody has right now. So, Mohal, you want to pick up the other angles as well?
Yeah, so the other angle is like the rising jihad extremism in South Asia.
Hmm.
So the earlier this year we saw the Easter Sunday attacks. I think which Kishore we covered in one of our earlier episodes,
Right,
which was a terrible blow to the peace in the island nation. Now these jihadi forces have gathered strength during the Sirisena rule, and Sirisena office had more or less agreed that they didn't uh, pass on the intelligence inputs given from India. I would say multiple intelligence inputs to avoid the deadly attacks to the executive government led by Ranil Wickremasinghe. Now, the Sinhalese majority nation has reposed faith in the Rajapaksas who were successful in fighting the LTTE and militarily defeating them. Now, while the military victories are one hell of an achievement for a decades long civil war, the question remains that can that guarantee a victory against jihad, which has its own dimensions to war? Kishore?
hmm. So the other angle that we also need to focus on is the growing pan-Asian Buddhist supremacy ideology. Buddhist extremist forces have gained a foothold in countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Thailand, which are all Buddhist majority countries, resulting in the alienation of Muslims in all these countries. And in fact, in Sri Lanka, it has resulted in the alienation of the Hindu Tamils also. Although the Indian government seems to have turned a blind eye to the fate of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, they are not in a position to influence the global opinion about it. Hence, it actually reflects poorly on India to be seen as a supporter of the Myanmar junta regime. Similarly, in Sri Lanka too, India's silence may be construed as support. And that is why India has mentioned to Mahinda that India wants the Tamils to be treated fairly and also to be treated as equal citizens in the future as well.
Yeah, I think there will be discussions on uh, making sure that the Tamil causes are or concerns are addressed to, but there won't be any overt statements to the same. It'll be more of a back channel discussion. What many people sometimes misread is that a lack of overt statements means that the issue has been completely sidelined, but I'm sure that there would be discussions for the same in the background, just not overtly, more
Right,
covertly.
right.
So another angle is the Sri Lanka status as a US Navy hub. Now, after the ouster of Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was viewed by the West as somebody with dubious human rights record, the US quickly entered the scene to establish a naval hub for itself on the island. Now, with the Rajapaksas back in power, it needs to be seen if US Navy can still continue operating out of the island. Be that is May, Indian Ocean is getting crowded and for good measure. Now, while the southern part of the Indian Ocean has many blue water naval forces like the US, the French, the United Kingdom operating in, the waters closer to India are witnessing tight competition between Indian, Chinese, and the United States navies. For India, this cannot be good news, as such a situation implies that India cannot establish sole supremacy over the Indian Ocean. I think like with India, even in the past, like had issues with the U.S. President Diego Garcia. So now, with if there was to be a naval base where U.S. Navy would operate out of, much closer to Indian shores, India might not feel comfortable in spite of the growing closeness of India-U.S. ties. So, Kishore, moving on, what is India's best case scenario in Sri Lanka under the Rajapakshas?
That's a good question. So, it's no secret that India wants the new dispensation in Colombo to safeguard India's strategic interests, including disallowing any Chinese military assets in the island nation and also submarines in the territorial waters. In addition, India will also expect maximum cooperation from Sri Lanka in fighting the Islamic State's growing presence in Tamil Nadu and Kerala in India, Sri Lanka, and also the Maldives. In this context, and also in the context of the changing political scenario within Sri Lanka, India has been quick to embrace political parties from across the spectrum. This helps India to have useful leverages, irrespective of who comes to power. It also implies that India might conveniently brush the human rights abuses allegations against the Rajapaksas under the carpet and might even vote against any such motions in the UNHRC. For such support, India might want Sri Lanka to continue boycotting SARC, which I already spoke about uh, when Ranil Wickremasinghe was the Prime Minister. And India might want Sri Lanka to wholeheartedly embrace BIMSTEC. On the domestic front, though, two Sinhala Buddhist extremist organizations, the Bodo Balasena and the Nava Sinhala Ravaya, have announced that they will be disbanded. Now, this raises a doubt on what the future has in store, especially since the Sinhala have recently faced the brunt of the Easter attacks. If these organizations are willing to disband, does this imply that they will have confidence that the Rajapaksas will tackle the jihadi element and root out the terror problem completely? Such a problem itself raises many more questions, as people will be reminded of the last few days of the Tamil Civil War, when the Sri Lankan armed forces indulged in a lot of extra judicial transgressions. So, Mohal, I think that's the kind of scenario that India is looking at. In fact, the hurriedly organized trip of Minister for External Affairs, S. Jaishankar, to Colombo should actually be seen in this context.
Mhm.
When Jaishankar was in Colombo, it was announced that India had officially invited Gotabaya to Delhi at the earliest convenient time. And we can now expect him to visit Delhi on the 29th of November. This will be Gotabaya's first visit abroad after taking charge. In fact, the listeners might not be aware of this. All the heads of state of all the SAARC countries, excluding Pakistan, of course, uh, their first visit abroad is actually generally to India. You know
Mhm.
that the Bangladesh Prime Minister or the Nepali Prime Minister, they generally come down to New Delhi immediately after taking charge. And similarly with Sri Lanka as well. So that practice is kept going even now. Now, India has to realize that Sri Lanka will not always dance to its tunes. After all, Sri Lanka has its own needs and challenges, and India cannot offer solutions for all of them. In other words, there is no way Sri Lanka will adopt a India first approach. On the contrary, Sri Lanka will continue to maintain close ties with China and Pakistan. India will have to look at this in a pragmatic manner. Irrespective of whether Gotabaya will renege on the Hambantota lease with the Chinese, which he actually promised during his election campaigning, India will have to quietly increase the economic interdependence that Sri Lanka has with us. The recent introduction of air connectivity between the two Tamil cities of Chennai in India and Jaffna in Sri Lanka is an example of how connectivity can be maintained between the two countries. Such connectivity and economic interdependence feed into each other, strengthening the overall ties even more.
Yeah,
Now,
I think
mhm,
one point I wanted to make, like, I think India has done a lot of work in northern Sri Lanka, including building of new homes, uh, which, and also Japan has done a significant amount of development work in Sri Lanka. So I think this is the place where India and Japan, as a counter to the debt-laden BRI, could
mhm,
use their friendship to undertake more development projects. I mean, India hasn't like had a stellar record of completing projects, but here it could use the Japanese expertise and even money if need be to help develop more infrastructure in Sri Lanka as a counter to the growing Chinese influence, which has been pervasive over the last term of the Rajapaksas.
In fact, Sajith Premadasa was the Minister for Housing, and he wanted to bank on his achievement of providing houses with Indian contribution. And
Mm-hmm.
he thought that providing the poor people with homes will actually keep him in good stead, and he might actually end up overthrowing the Rajapaksas. But that did not happen. But that's the connection that how that's the housing connection between New Delhi and Premadasa.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so the return of the Rajapaksas gives New Delhi a unique opportunity. The West has more or less burned away all the bridges of communication that existed with the Rajapaksas. And New Delhi can actually take the initiative and help in establishing a new channel of communication that goes via New Delhi. This will help New Delhi as it will have a useful leverage against both the West and the Rajapaksas.
Yeah, I think uh, like Rajapaksa's, like in the especially Mahinda, he did note the backlash against the the growing closeness with China
Mm-hmm.
over the a second term. And as you had alluded to, I mean, there were rumors that the Raw station chief in Colombo helped gather like Sri Sena and Ranil Wickremasinghe as a combined opposition candidate and helped defeat him. I mean, that was a rumor back
Mm-hmm.
then. So he did understand that whether he likes it or not, like India is a significant player, and he cannot lean too far to the Chinese. I mean, granted, he did go there because, as you said, like historically when he came to India for military help, India denied it, though there are some reports that India did provide intelligence input but not military hardware because of the domestic political compulsions.
Mm-hmm.
But he does understand that India is a significant player in the Indian Ocean region, and he needs to balance ties. So, even in the Hambantota, there were reports that the project was offered to India first, but since it wasn't a
Right.
viable project, it went to China. So he knows that he can't lean too far. I mean, he'll still keep coming back to India. So that's where the opportunity that India has to leverage, that whenever Sri Lanka asks for help, it should help in uh, as much as possible, because what's going to happen is then the Sri Lankans are going to leverage China against India, and that's what I think all of India's smaller neighbors in the neighborhood have been doing uh, uh, all along for the past few years. The only change is that, like, before they didn't have a counterweight to India to leverage getting a better deal. Now with the aggressive China in the South Asian region, they have two players to play off, where they could use, like, okay, you're giving me this deal, like what about the, let me
Mm-hmm.
go to the other guy and see if I can get a better deal. So that will be some of the games, that the great game, like, which will be played between India and China. But anyways, coming back to Rajapaksa, I think he understands that he cannot lean too far one way, so he will have to come back. So some of the fear, I mean, because of the past history, is a bit a little bit overblown in my opinion, that he will like solidly go with China and not consider New Delhi's red lines, because he knows that in the end he will run into trouble if he gets a foul of like what New Delhi is trying to do in the neighborhood. Okay, Kishore, any final thoughts from you on this?
No, I think we're good. I think we have covered whatever we wanted to.
Okay, so coming to the recommendations for this week, Kishore, do you want to share anything that you read which is worth recommending to our listeners?
I would actually recommend Harita Pusada's piece on mind.net. I think she kind of used the right word for it. She said that India will have to recalibrate its Sri Lanka policy. So I think that was the right choice of words when it
Yeah, I
comes to
agree.
India
Same.
bilateral ties with Sri Lanka. So I think that's the
Hmm.
article that I would recommend. Mohal,
Yeah,
what
same.
would you?
Same article. I was going to recommend the same
Oh, okay.
article for this week. So okay. So with that, friends, we come to the end of this week's episode where we covered in detail the presidential elections in Sri Lanka and the fast-paced developments that have followed the results. We also covered in depth what should India's response be to these new developments in the island nation. To continue hearing about such interesting topics, do subscribe to our channel India Rising wherever you are listening to us. If you have not left us a review, we urge you to do so as it helps other listeners like you in finding us. We would also like to hear from you if you have any suggestions or any topics that you would like us to cover. Do remember that these topics should be directly related to Indian foreign policy. This is Mohal and Kishor signing off.